He left his dog at the shelter, thinking he had no other choice. 7 years later, fate brought them back together, but in a way no one could have ever imagined. When a firefighter adopts the heartbroken golden retriever, neither man nor dog knows they're about to be bound by something much bigger than chance. But just when life seems to find its balance again, tragedy strikes, setting off a chain of events that will change everything. What happens when a mother, a hero, and a lost soul are brought together by the very dog they all loved? And will they get their second chance before it's too late? Stay until the end for this incredible story of loss, love, and destiny. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The autumn wind whipped through the nearly empty parking lot, sending dead leaves skittering across the cracked pavement. Lillian Thomas gripped Mac's leash tighter, her knuckles white against the worn leather, fighting the urge to turn around and run back home. Each step toward the animal shelter felt like walking through deep water, slow and painful, as if time itself was trying to hold her back. Max, their beloved golden retriever, padded along beside her, his usual bounce missing from his step. His tail, normally wagging with endless enthusiasm, hung low and still. Maybe he sensed something was wrong, the way dogs always seem to know. His warm brown eyes kept glancing up at her, full of trust that made her heart ache even more. "Max, wait!" Oliver, her 5-year-old, clung to the dog's tail, his small face streaked with tears and reddened from crying. His winter coat was unzipped despite the cold, evidence of their rushed departure from home. The sight of her youngest son's pain made Lillian's vision blur. The smell of wet leaves filled the air, reminding her of happier autumn days when Daniel would rake huge piles for the boys to jump in, Max bounding through them with pure joy. She could almost hear their laughter echoing across time. But Daniel was gone now, taken by a fire that had stolen more than just her husband. It had taken their security, their home, and now it was taking Max too. Inside the shelter, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows on the gray tile floor. The antiseptic smell mixed with the scent of animals and cleaning supplies. Distant barks echoed through the corridors, making Mac's ears perk up. Mrs. Callahan looked up from her desk, her lined face softening with understanding as soon as she saw them, her eyes filling with compassion. She'd likely shown countless others in similar situations. "Oh, honey," she said quietly, reaching for the surrender papers with practiced gentleness. Lillian's hands shook as she stroked Mac's soft fur, running her fingers through the golden strands one last time. "I'm so sorry, boy," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "I'm so sorry." "Mommy, please." Oliver tugged at her worn sweater, his sobs growing louder and more desperate with each passing second. "We can't leave Max here. Please." The empty space beside her felt enormous, where Noah should have been standing. Her 12-year-old had refused to come, his last word still ringing in her ears like an accusation. "I hate you for this." Mrs. Callahan pushed the papers across the desk, the form stark and official against the wooden surface. "Sometimes," she said gently, her voice heavy with experience, "letting go is the kindest thing." Lillian's signature was barely legible through her tears, the pen trembling in her grip. She knelt beside Max, wrapping her arms around his warm, solid body one last time, breathing him in. He smelled like home, like summer days and muddy paws and unconditional love, like everything she was about to lose. "I'll find you again," she whispered into his fur, making a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. "I promise." Mac's tail drooped as she handed the leash to Mrs. Callahan, the leather feeling like lead in her hands. He looked confused, his eyes following Lillian as she turned away, his whole body seeming to deflate. Oliver's wails grew louder, forcing her to scoop him up into her arms. She rushed toward the exit, her son's tears soaking into her shoulder, his small body shaking with grief. The shelter door swung shut behind them with a heavy thud, and through it came the sound that would haunt her dreams, Max's single, mournful bark, full of loss and longing, echoing through the building like a farewell she'd never forget. The morning sun cast long shadows across the animal shelter's entrance as Jake Lawson stood at the door, his hand hesitating on the handle. Dark circles ringed his eyes, evidence of another sleepless night filled with memories he couldn't shake. The face of that little girl in the fire still haunted him, her cry for help echoing in his dreams. "You need company, Jake." Captain Martinez's words from yesterday's shift rang in his ears. "A reason to get out of your own head." Jake ran a hand over his unshaven face and pushed the door open. The cacophony of barking hit him like a wall, making him wince. The sharp smell of cleaning products mixed with the distinct scent of dozens of dogs made his nose wrinkle. Mrs. Callahan looked up from her desk, her experienced eyes taking in his uncomfortable stance and the way he flinched at each loud bark. "First time at a shelter?" she asked kindly. "Yeah," Jake mumbled, shoving his hands in his pockets. "Just looking." She nodded knowingly and stood up. "Follow me. I think I might have someone you should meet." They walked past kennels of jumping, barking dogs, each one vying for attention. But when they reached the last row, Jake noticed something different. A golden retriever sat in the corner of his kennel, head down, completely still among the chaos. "This is Max," Mrs. Callahan said softly. "His family brought him in yesterday. They had no choice. Lost their home." She paused, watching Jake's reaction. "He hasn't moved much since they left." Jake stared at the dog, something twisting in his chest. Max's posture, the way his shoulders slumped, the defeated tilt of his head. It was like looking in a mirror. The dog didn't even bother to look up, as if he'd given up hope entirely. Kneeling down, Jake called out quietly, "Hey, buddy." Max's ears twitched slightly, but he remained still, his eyes fixed on the floor. Jake recognized that look. The one that said something precious had been lost, and nothing would ever be the same. "His owner was in tears when she left," Mrs. Callahan mentioned. "Sweet family. The little boy wouldn't stop crying." Jake stood up, taking a step back. "I don't need a dog," he said gruffly. "I can barely—" He trailed off, turning to leave. But something made him glance back one last time. Max had finally lifted his head, just slightly, his brown eyes meeting Jake's. There was something in that gaze, a quiet understanding of loss that struck Jake to his core. Before he knew what he was doing, he was back at the front desk. "The paperwork," he said roughly. "For Max. What do I need to fill out?" 20 minutes later, Jake sat in his truck, gripping the steering wheel. Max sat silently in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the passing scenery, as if searching for familiar faces in the blur of buildings and trees. "What the hell am I doing?" Jake muttered to himself. But Max didn't respond, lost in his own world of grief and confusion. Jake's apartment felt hollow as he unlocked the door, Max trailing behind him like a shadow. The dog padded inside, found a spot by the entrance, and simply sat down, his eyes fixed on the door. The sight made Jake's chest tighten uncomfortably. "Come on, boy. This is home now." The words sounded empty even to his own ears. Max didn't move, didn't even blink. In the kitchen, Jake fumbled with the bag of kibble he'd bought at the pet store. The sound of food hitting the metal bowl echoed in the quiet apartment. He set it down near Max, but the dog showed no interest. "You've got to eat something," Jake muttered, running his hands through his hair in frustration. He tried everything he could think of. The new tennis ball rolled across the floor, untouched. When he reached to scratch behind Max's ears, the dog allowed it, but remained still, his gaze never leaving the door. The scene triggered a memory Jake had buried deep. The weeks after Emily's death. He'd been 15. She'd been 12. The empty chair at the dinner table. The silence where her laughter used to be. He remembered staring at the front door, willing her to walk through it, knowing she never would. "I can't do this," Jake growled, pacing the living room. "I'm not equipped for this. I can barely handle my own problems without dealing with an emotionally damaged dog." The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Hours ticked by. The sun set, casting long shadows across the apartment floor. Jake found himself sitting on the floor beside Max, his back against the wall. Without thinking, his hand reached out, stroking the dog's golden fur. Max remained motionless, his vigil unwavering. No whimpers, no barks, just patient waiting for a family that wouldn't return. Jake's throat felt tight as he watched him. The evening wore on. Jake's eyes grew heavy, and he eventually moved to the couch, dropping onto it with exhaustion. Sleep came quickly, deeper than usual. When he woke hours later, something warm pressed against his side. Max had left his post by the door and curled up next to the couch, his body touching Jake's dangling hand. Something shifted in Jake's chest, a crack in the walls he'd built so carefully. "Guess we're stuck with each other, huh?" he mumbled drowsily. Max didn't move from his spot, but his tail twitched slightly, the first response he'd shown all day. The winter morning painted the town in pristine white, transforming the familiar streets into a peaceful wonderland. But inside Memorial Hospital's busy corridors, Lillian Thomas felt anything but peaceful. Her navy blue scrubs rustled as she hurried between patients' rooms, her shoulders heavy with the weight of another 12-hour shift. "Lillian, you need to take a break, doctor," Hannah Patel called out, catching up to her at the nurse's station. Her dark eyes were filled with concern. "When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Lillian managed a tired smile. "I'm fine, Hannah. Really?" "You're not fine," Nurse Gina chimed in, her weathered face stern but kind. "You're running yourself into the ground." Lillian busied herself with a patient's chart, avoiding their worried glances. 7 years had passed since Daniel's death, since that heart-wrenching day at the shelter with Max. She'd rebuilt their lives piece by piece, gotten her nursing degree, found a better-paying job, moved into a small but comfortable apartment. Her boys were growing up too fast. Noah, now 12, had become her rock. He packed lunches for Oliver, helped with homework, and never complained about having to be more responsible than other kids his age. And Oliver, sweet Oliver, still occasionally mentioned Max, but his memories were growing fuzzy around the edges.
"At least join us for coffee," Hannah pressed, but Lillian shook her head.
"Maybe next time. The boys are waiting." As her shift finally ended, Lillian trudged through the snow-covered parking lot. The winter air bit at her cheeks, but she barely noticed. Her mind was already home, thinking about the frozen lasagna she'd heat up for dinner. Behind the wheel of her old Honda, Lillian let out a long sigh. The roads were slick with ice, requiring extra concentration. Street lights cast long shadows across the snow, and her eyelids felt impossibly heavy. The guilt of giving Max away still gnawed at her conscience. Some nights she dreamed about his confused eyes as she walked away. She gripped the steering wheel tighter, trying to stay focused on the road ahead. Suddenly, bright headlights flooded her rearview mirror. A semi-truck appeared, swerving dangerously into her lane. Her world went black. The streetlights cast long shadows across the icy road as Lillian's car crawled through the winter night. Her eyelids felt heavy, weighted down by exhaustion from her grueling hospital shift. The radio hummed quietly, some soft rock song she couldn't quite place. She blinked hard, trying to focus. "Just 15 more minutes," she whispered to herself, thinking of Noah and Oliver waiting at home. Mrs. Peterson from next door was watching them, but Lillian hated being away from her boys for so long. Her mind drifted to earlier that day, when a golden retriever had visited the pediatric ward with a therapy dog program. The sight had made her heart clench, the dog's gentle eyes reminding her so much of Max. 7 years, and still the guilt gnawed at her. The road ahead blurred slightly. Lillian shook her head, fighting the fatigue. Just for a second, one tiny second. Her eyes grew too heavy to keep open. Suddenly, blinding lights filled her rearview mirror. Her eyes snapped wide as a horn blared, deafening in the quiet night. A massive semi-truck swerved into her lane, its headlights burning straight into her eyes. Lillian's hands jerked the wheel hard. Her tires lost their grip on the slick road. The world spun in a sickening blur of lights and shadows. Metal screamed as her car slammed into the guardrail. The impact threw her forward, then back. Glass exploded around her in a deadly shower. Pain shot through her body like electricity. Her head throbbed where it had hit something. She couldn't tell what. A high-pitched ringing filled her ears, drowning out everything else. Through her fading vision, she saw blood on the cracked windshield. "Noah! Oliver!" She tried to whisper, but the words wouldn't come. Darkness crept in from the edges of her vision, heavy and unstoppable. She fought to stay conscious, but it was like trying to swim through tar. The last thing she heard was distant sirens before everything went black. Somewhere in the night, tires squealed as a car pulled over. A shaky voice called 911. At the firehouse across town, Jake Lawson jumped into action as the call came through. He climbed into the driver's seat of the rescue truck, Max settling into his usual spot beside him. The dog had become his constant companion on calls, a silent guardian who seemed to sense when he was needed most. The sirens wailed as they raced through the empty streets. Jake's jaw clenched as he spotted the wreckage ahead. A car crumpled against the guardrail, its front end completely crushed. He grabbed his rescue tools and rushed to the driver's side. The door was mangled, but he managed to force it open with a grunt of effort. His heart stopped. Through the web of cracked glass, illuminated by the flashing emergency lights, he saw a woman's face. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, her dark hair matted against her pale skin. Behind him, Max suddenly erupted in frantic barks. The dog's cries were desperate, unlike anything Jake had heard from him before. Something about this felt wrong, felt important. "Stay with me," Jake muttered, gripping his rescue tool tighter as he stared at the unconscious woman's familiar face. The steady beep of hospital monitors filled the quiet room as Lillian's eyes fluttered open. Her body felt like one massive bruise, every breath sending sharp pains through her ribs. The white ceiling tiles above her swam in and out of focus as she tried to get her bearings. A soft whimpering sound caught her attention. Something warm and wet touched her right hand, which hung slightly off the bed. The gentle pressure against her palm felt achingly familiar. Lillian turned her head slowly, wincing at the stiffness in her neck. Through vision still blurry from medication, she made out a golden shape beside her bed. As her eyes adjusted, her heart nearly stopped. Those eyes. She would know those eyes anywhere. Deep brown pools of warmth and wisdom that had looked at her with such confusion and hurt on that terrible day at the shelter. But it couldn't be. "Max?" Her voice came out as a raspy whisper, barely audible over the monitors. The dog's tail began to wag gently, and he pressed his nose more firmly into her palm. A small whine escaped him as he licked her fingers with such tender familiarity that tears immediately welled up in her eyes. The door opened, and a man in a firefighter's uniform walked in, holding a clipboard. He stopped short when he saw Lillian was awake and staring at Max. Their eyes met, and the clipboard lowered slowly to his side. "Do you know this dog?" His voice was deep, cautious. Lillian couldn't speak for a moment. Her throat felt too tight, memories washing over her like waves. The shelter, the goodbye, her promise whispered into Max's fur. "I'll find you again." Max hadn't moved from her side, his head now resting on the edge of her bed, those soulful eyes moving between her and the firefighter. His tail kept wagging, slowly, steadily, like he was trying to tell them both something. Lillian's voice cracked. She swallowed hard, tears spilling down her cheeks. "He's my dog." The firefighter, Jake, according to his nameplate, stiffened visibly. The clipboard slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor. His face drained of color as he stared at Max, then back at Lillian. The weight of this impossible coincidence settling over the room like a heavy blanket. The hospital room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the steady beep of monitors and Max's soft panting. Lillian's trembling fingers moved through his familiar golden fur, finding the same spot behind his ears that she used to scratch. Max leaned into her touch, his eyes never leaving her face. Jake stood against the wall, arms crossed tightly over his chest. His jaw worked as he watched them, struggling to make sense of this impossible situation. "I never thought—" Lillian's voice cracked. She took a shaky breath and started again. "My husband Daniel was a firefighter. After he died in an accident, everything fell apart. I lost my job, then our house. I tried so hard to keep our family together, but—" Tears rolled down her cheeks. "The apartment we found wouldn't allow pets. I had no family to take him, no friends who could help. I had 2 young boys who needed a home." Max rested his head on her lap, and she wiped her eyes with her free hand. "I never wanted to abandon him. I promised my boys I'd find him again someday. I never thought it would be like this." Jake uncrossed his arms, running a hand through his hair. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. "I didn't just find Max. He saved me." He moved closer to the bed, his eyes distant with memory. "I adopted him the day after you left him at the shelter. I was in a bad place. Lost a kid in a fire I couldn't get to in time. Couldn't sleep. Couldn't function. Max was the only thing that got me through it." Lillian looked up at him, really seeing him now. The weight of his own pain visible in the lines around his eyes, the set of his shoulders. "He wouldn't eat that first night," Jake continued. "Just sat by the door, waiting. But somehow, he knew what I needed. Started sleeping next to me when the nightmares came. Got me out of bed every morning when I didn't want to face the world." They looked at each other, the realization hitting them both, how Max had connected their broken pieces long before they ever met. Jake's hand unconsciously tightened on the bed rail. 7 years. 7 years of morning walks, shared meals, quiet understanding. Max was his dog now, wasn't he? Lillian saw the conflict in Jake's face and felt it mirror her own. Did she have any right to come back into Max's life? To disrupt the bond he'd formed with Jake? Before either could speak, a knock at the door made them turn. It swung open slowly, and 2 boys stepped inside. Noah, tall and serious for his 12 years, and Oliver, his 10-year-old brother, hanging close behind him. Noah's eyes swept the room, landing on Max. His whole body went still. The hospital room's fluorescent lights hummed softly as Noah stood frozen in the doorway, his breath catching in his throat. His eyes grew wide, fixed on the golden retriever beside his mother's bed. Time seemed to stop. Max's head snapped up, his ears perking forward. His tail, which had been gently wagging, suddenly began thumping wildly against the floor. A low whine escaped his throat. "Max?" Noah's voice trembled, barely above a whisper. The name hung in the air for just a moment, before Max launched himself forward, nearly knocking the boy over in his excitement. Noah dropped to his knees, wrapping his arms around Max's neck as tears streamed down his face. Max's whole body wiggled with joy as he covered Noah's face with enthusiastic licks. Oliver, standing just behind his brother, let out a delighted laugh and dove into the reunion, his small hands buried in Max's thick fur. Lillian watched from her hospital bed, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. Her hand covered her mouth, trying to contain the sob that threatened to escape. The sight of her boys with their beloved dog, a moment she'd dreamed of but never truly believed would happen, overwhelmed her completely. Jake remained by the wall, his throat tight as he watched the scene unfold. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, his chest aching with emotions he couldn't quite name. Noah finally pulled back, wiping his nose with his sleeve. His eyes were red, but there was a spark in them that hadn't been there before. He looked up at Jake, sniffling. "Where did you find him?" Lillian's voice was soft as she explained about the accident, about Jake being the firefighter who rescued her, and how Max had been with him. As she spoke, Noah's expression shifted, and he turned to her with pain etched across his young face. "Why didn't you try harder to find him?" The question came out small and hurt, hitting Lillian like a physical blow. She flinched, guilt washing over her in a crushing wave. Jake cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. His voice was gruff but gentle. "We need to figure out what happens next." The boy's arms tightened around Max instinctively. Oliver pressed his face into the dog's fur, while Noah looked between Jake and his mother. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Who did Max truly belong to now? The hospital room grew quiet as evening settled in. The only sounds were the gentle beeping of monitors and Max's contented sighs as he lay wedged between Noah and Oliver on the small couch. Lillian watched her boys from her bed, their faces peaceful for the first time since the accident. Jake sat beside her in the visitor's chair, his arms crossed tightly over his chest, lost in thought. The question hung heavy in the air, unspoken but impossible to ignore. What would happen to Max now? Jake cleared his throat. "Listen," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "Max has been with me for 7 years. He's more than just a dog to me. He's my best friend." His hands gripped the arms of the chair. "He got me through some really dark times." Lillian nodded slowly, understanding in her eyes. "I know, but he was part of our family first." She glanced at her sleeping boys. "They've never stopped missing him. Not a single day." Noah stirred, sitting up slightly. His eyes were red-rimmed but determined. "I don't want to take him from you," he said to Jake. "But," his voice cracked, "I don't want to lose him again either." Jake ran a hand through his hair, exhaling deeply. Looking at Max curled up with the boys, he couldn't deny the connection. These kids had loved Max long before he ever did. "What if," Jake started carefully, "what if we didn't make any big decisions right now? You and the boys could visit Max regularly. We can take things one step at a time." Lillian bit her lip, considering. "Wouldn't that just be putting off the inevitable? Can Max come home with us? Just for a few days." Oliver's small voice piped up from the couch. His eyes were wide and hopeful. Jake's chest tightened. He'd never spent a night without Max since adopting him. The thought made his stomach churn. But looking at the boys' faces, he knew what he had to do. "How about we start with weekends?" he suggested, his voice gentler than before. "See how that goes?" Mac's tail thumped against the couch cushions, completely unaware of the weight of this moment. The tension in the room seemed to ease slightly. Lillian turned to Jake, really seeing him for the first time. Their eyes met, and she gave him a sincere smile. "Thank you," she said softly. Jake nodded, but something in his expression suggested this was just the beginning. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through Jake's apartment windows as Lillian pulled up with Noah and Oliver. Her hands felt clammy on the steering wheel. This wasn't just about Max anymore. It was about navigating something entirely new. Before they even knocked, they heard Max excited whining through the door. The moment Jake opened it, Max burst forward, his whole body wiggling with joy as he rushed straight into Noah's waiting arms. "Hey, buddy!" Noah laughed as Max covered his face in kisses. Oliver joined the pile, giggling as Max tried to lick them both at once. Jake stood awkwardly in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "Come on in," he said, stepping aside. Lillian walked in slowly, taking in Jake's apartment. It was surprisingly neat, with comfortable furniture and a few framed photographs on the walls. The smell of cooking filled the air. "I hope you guys like lasagna," Jake said, heading to the kitchen. "It's about all I can make well." "It smells amazing," Lillian replied, following him while the boys played with Max in the living room. The first hour was stiff with polite small talk and careful movements around each other. But as Jake worked in the kitchen, Lillian found herself drawn into conversation. He moved with surprising grace, explaining how he'd learned to cook from his grandmother. "Need any help?" she asked, watching him chop vegetables for a salad. "You could grab those plates." He nodded toward a cabinet. They reached for the same plate at the same moment, their hands brushing. Both pulled back quickly, but something flickered in the air between them, a spark of awareness neither was ready to acknowledge. The boys' laughter drifted in from the living room, punctuated by Mac's happy barks. Jake and Lillian shared a smile, the tension finally beginning to ease. As the evening progressed, Lillian noticed little things about Jake. The way his eyes crinkled when he really smiled. How he remembered Oliver was allergic to tomatoes and made him a separate portion. The gentle way he spoke to Max. The boys made themselves at home, sprawling on Jake's couch as if they'd been there 100 times before. Even Max seemed more relaxed, moving easily between all of them, as if he'd finally found his place. When it was time to leave, Noah looked up at Jake hopefully. "Can we do this every week?" Jake hesitated, glancing at Lillian, then back at Noah. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, we can do that." Lillian lay in her darkened bedroom, counting the shadows on her ceiling. Sleep felt impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Jake's smile from earlier that evening, the way his face had lit up when Oliver showed him a magic trick. Across town, Jake sat on his couch, absently scratching Mac's ears. The house felt too quiet now. The echo of Lillian's laugh lingered in his mind, along with the scent of her perfume that still clung to the throw pillow where she'd been sitting. Max whined softly, nudging Jake's hand. The dog's brown eyes seemed to see right through him. "I know, buddy," Jake muttered. "I'm being stupid." At the hospital the next day, Lillian fumbled with a patient chart, her mind elsewhere. Gina, her fellow nurse, caught her dropping the same file twice. "Okay, spill it," Gina said, pulling her into the break room. "What's going on with you?" Lillian's cheeks flushed. "Nothing. I'm just tired." "Uh-huh." Gina crossed her arms. "This wouldn't have anything to do with that handsome firefighter who rescued you, would it?" "Gina," Lillian protested, but her face grew warmer. "Honey," Gina's voice softened. "You're allowed to feel something again, you know. Daniel would want you to be happy." Tears pricked at Lillian's eyes. It feels wrong. Like I'm—" She couldn't finish the sentence. Meanwhile, Jake threw himself into work, taking extra shifts at the station. Anything to avoid thinking about the way his heart jumped whenever Lillian texted about their next visit. Max watched him pace his apartment, tail thumping against the floor. When Jake finally sat down, Max immediately pressed against his leg, offering silent comfort. Jake buried his face in Max's fur. The familiar gesture brought little comfort tonight. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Lillian's face, heard her laugh, felt the accidental brush of her hand against his. He didn't deserve this. Not after failing to save that little girl in the fire. Not after everything. But Max nudged his hand again, more insistent this time, as if saying, "You're wrong." Back in her bedroom, Lillian touched her wedding ring, still hanging on a chain around her neck. "I miss you, Daniel," she whispered into the darkness. But for the first time in years, the ache felt different. Less like an open wound, more like a healing scar. Neither of them was ready to name what was growing between them. Neither wanted to acknowledge how their weekly visits had become the highlight of their days. How they found excuses to text each other between visits. How their eyes met and lingered just a little too long. But they both knew deep down that something was changing, and it terrified them both. The Winter Festival transformed their small town into a wonderland of twinkling lights and holiday magic. Jake stood at the entrance, his heart thumping as he watched Lillian's car pull up. He'd spent 20 minutes deciding what to wear, feeling like a teenager again. Oliver burst out first, practically bouncing. "Jake, look at all the lights!" The festival sprawled before them, ice skaters gliding on the temporary rink, vendors selling steaming cups of hot cocoa, and strings of white lights crisscrossing overhead, like stars brought down to earth. "Can we get hot chocolate?" Oliver tugged at Jake's sleeve. "Sure, buddy." Jake smiled, then caught Lillian's eye. She was wearing a red knit hat, her cheeks pink from the cold. As they walked through the festival, their shoulders kept brushing. Neither moved away. Oliver soon demanded a better view, and before Jake knew it, the boy was perched on his shoulders, pointing excitedly at everything. "Look, Mom, I can see the whole festival." Noah walked slightly ahead, but Jake noticed him glancing back, watching them with thoughtful eyes. The boy's expression had changed lately, less guarded, more accepting. At the hot chocolate stand, Jake bought 4 steaming cups. When he handed Lillian hers, their fingers touched. This time, they lingered. "Thanks," she said softly. They found a quiet spot near the ice rink. Oliver and Noah went to watch the skaters up close, leaving Jake and Lillian alone. "This is nice," she said, wrapping her hands around her cup. "I haven't been to the festival since—" She trailed off, but Jake knew she meant since Daniel. "I'm glad you came," Jake said. He wanted to say more, so much more, about how she made him feel alive again, about how her smile made his day brighter. Lillian turned toward him, her eyes soft in the glow of the festival lights. "Jake, I've been wanting to tell you something." "Mom!" Noah's voice cut through the moment. "Oliver's trying to climb the snowman." Lillian laughed, but Jake caught the flash of something in her eyes. Disappointment, maybe? Later that night, as Jake walked them to their car, the air felt electric with unspoken words. Snowflakes started falling, catching in Lillian's hair. She looked up at him, and for a moment Jake thought about kissing her. Instead, he simply said, "Good night." As Lillian drove home, her phone buzzed. Gina's text lit up the screen. "So, was it a date?" Lillian stared at the message, her heart pounding against her ribs, unable to form a reply. The aroma of simmering vegetables filled Lillian's kitchen as she chopped carrots for dinner. Through the doorway, she could hear Noah and Oliver arguing over their video game, their playful banter bringing a smile to her face. A knock at the door made her pause. Wiping her hands on a dish towel, she walked over and opened it. Her heart skipped when she saw Jake standing there, Max wagging his tail beside him. "Hey," Jake said, holding up a grocery bag. "Figured you might need some help." Lillian blinked, surprised but pleased. "Oh, come in." Soon they fell into an easy rhythm in the kitchen. Jake took over chopping duty while Lillian stirred the soup, adding herbs and checking the seasoning. Oliver wandered in, telling his latest jokes that made them both laugh despite how terrible they were. "What do you call a bear with no teeth?" Oliver asked, grinning. "A gummy bear." Jake groaned but chuckled, and Lillian couldn't help but notice how his eyes crinkled when he smiled. Noah sat at the kitchen counter, watching them all with quiet interest. He hadn't seen his mom this relaxed in years. The kitchen felt warm and cozy, filled with the kind of comfortable silence that comes from people who don't need to fill every moment with words. Max lay under the table, content just to be near everyone. Lillian reached for the salt shaker just as Jake did. Their fingers brushed, and they both froze. She looked up, meeting his eyes. Time seemed to slow down. Jake leaned in slightly, and Lillian felt her breath catch. "Mom!" Noah's voice cut through the moment. "Oliver spilled juice on the couch." They jumped apart. Lillian's cheeks flushed as she hurried to grab paper towels. Jake cleared his throat, suddenly very interested in chopping the remaining onions. Later, as Jake gathered his things to leave, he lingered in the doorway. Max sat patiently beside him. The moment from earlier hung between them, unspoken. "Thanks for helping," Lillian said softly, not quite meeting his eyes. Jake nodded. "Yeah, anytime." After the door closed, Lillian leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. Her heart was still pounding. Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Lillian poured cereal for the boys. Another ordinary morning. Noah scrolled through his phone while Oliver complained about his math homework. Just like any other day. Then came the thud. Heavy, final, wrong. Lillian's heart stopped. She dropped the cereal box and rushed to the living room. There lay Max, sprawled on the floor, unnaturally still. "Max!" Oliver's voice cracked. He knelt beside the dog, shaking his shoulder. "Max, wake up!" Noah stood frozen, his face pale. "Mom?" Lillian dropped to her knees, hands trembling as she checked Max's breathing. Each shallow breath seemed to take too much effort. His eyes were closed, his usually vibrant body limp. "We have to get him to the vet. Now!" Lillian's voice came out steadier than she felt. "Boys, get your coats." With shaking fingers, she pulled out her phone and called Jake. He answered on the first ring. "Jake, it's Max. Something's wrong. He collapsed and—" "I'm on my way," Jake cut in, his voice tight with worry. They managed to get Max into the car, Oliver crying quietly in the back seat while Noah helped keep Max stable. The drive to the animal hospital felt endless, each red light an eternity. The veterinary staff rushed out with a stretcher as soon as they pulled up. They whisked Max away through double doors, leaving Lillian and the boys standing in the sterile waiting room, the smell of antiseptic burning their noses. Jake burst through the entrance minutes later, his firefighter uniform wrinkled, face flushed from running. His eyes found Lillian's immediately. "He was fine yesterday," Lillian whispered, tears threatening to spill. "What happened?" "He was fine." Jake moved closer, his hand finding hers. They sat together, the boys huddled close, waiting. The clock on the wall ticked mercilessly. Finally, after what felt like hours, the vet emerged. Her face was serious as she approached them. "Max has a rare heart condition," she explained gently. "Without immediate treatment, I'm afraid he won't make it." Lillian's grip on Jake's hand tightened. They looked at each other, understanding passing between them. This wasn't just about a dog anymore. Max was the thread that had brought them together, that had helped heal their broken pieces. He was family. "Whatever it takes," Jake said firmly, voicing what they all felt. "We can't lose him." The kitchen light cast a soft glow over the scattered papers on Lillian's table. Jake rubbed his tired eyes as he studied another medical form. Lillian's hands shook slightly as she calculated numbers on her phone. "The specialist says it's a complex procedure," Jake said quietly. "But without it..." Lillian swallowed hard. "What are our options?" "There's the high-risk surgery. It's the traditional approach." Jake pushed forward a detailed treatment plan. "Or this experimental treatment. It's newer, but the success rates are promising." "And if we do nothing?" Lillian's voice cracked. Jake's jaw tightened. "That's not an option." Lillian stared at the total cost. Her chest felt tight. "Jake, this is..." "I'll pay for it," Jake said firmly. "All of it." "No." Lillian shook her head. "I can't let you do that. You've already done so much." "Then we'll split it," Jake insisted. "We'll figure it out together." A floorboard creaked. They turned to see Noah in the doorway, tears streaming down his face. "Please," Noah whispered. "We have to save him. He came back to us once. We can't let him go again." Lillian met Jake's eyes. No words were needed. They both knew what had to be done. The next hour was a blur of phone calls. Jake contacted specialists while Lillian arranged payment plans. They scheduled the treatment for the following week. "Stay," Lillian said, when Jake finally stood to leave. "It's late. You can take the couch." Jake nodded, too exhausted to argue. Max, weak but still aware, followed him to the living room and settled beside the couch. Later that night, Lillian crept downstairs for a glass of water. She paused in the living room doorway. Jake lay on the couch, wide awake, gently stroking Max's fur. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting shadows across his worried face. Max's tail thumped weakly against the floor. Lillian stood there watching them. Something shifted in her heart as she realized Jake wasn't just someone who had cared for Max all these years. He wasn't just the firefighter who had saved her life. He was part of their family now, woven into their lives as naturally as breathing. The clock on Lillian's living room wall ticked softly as she walked down the stairs. A thick blanket draped over her arm. Jake lay on the couch, one hand absently stroking Max's fur while he stared at the ceiling. The street light outside cast long shadows across his face. "Thought you might need this," Lillian said quietly, holding out the blanket. Jake's eyes shifted to her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks." He sat up slightly, careful not to disturb Max, who dozed fitfully beside the couch. Lillian hesitated, then sat on the edge of the coffee table. The silence between them felt heavy with unspoken words. "I don't think I can lose him," Jake finally admitted, his voice rough with emotion. His fingers curled into Max's fur. Lillian nodded, understanding flowing through her. "I know." Jake's eyes met hers, and something in his gaze made her heart skip. "I don't think I can lose you either." The words hung in the air between them. Lillian's breath caught in her throat. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs. This was the moment she could pull away, protect herself from feeling anything more, or she could finally let go of her fears. Jake started to lean back, his expression clouding. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." Lillian reached out, her fingers finding his hand. "I don't want to run anymore." The touch seemed to freeze them both. Jake's eyes searched her face, asking a silent question. Slowly, carefully, he leaned forward, Lillian felt herself moving to meet him. Their lips met softly, hesitantly, a gentle kiss that held 7 years of separate grief and shared healing. A small whimper from Max broke the moment. They pulled apart to see him shifting in his sleep, paw twitching as he dreamed. They both laughed quietly, the tension breaking. But as their eyes met again, Lillian knew everything had changed. There was no more pretending this was just about Max, or about weekend visits. This was about all of them together. The veterinary hospital waiting room was bathed in the pale light of dawn. Lillian sat rigid in an uncomfortable plastic chair, her untouched coffee growing cold in her hands. Jake was beside her, his shoulders tense as he leaned forward, elbows on his knees, rubbing his hands together nervously. The clock on the wall seemed to mock them with each tick. 3 hours had passed since they'd wheeled Max into surgery, but it felt like days. "He's strong," Jake murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His words seemed more like a prayer than a statement. Lillian's mind drifted back to that autumn morning 7 years ago. The weight of Max's leash in her trembling hands, Oliver's tears, the promise she'd whispered into Max's fur. "I'll find you again." Now here she was, having found him only to face losing him all over again. Jake stared at the surgery doors, lost in his own memories. That first night with Max, when the dog had finally curled up next to him on the couch. He'd been so broken then, haunted by faces he couldn't save. But Max had given him something to live for, a reason to wake up each morning. The squeak of rubber soles made them both jump. A vet tech in blue scrubs walked in, and they shot to their feet in unison. "The surgery is still ongoing," the tech said gently. "Dr. Roberts wanted me to let you know it'll be a few more hours. We're doing everything we can." Lillian's legs felt weak. She swayed slightly, and Jake steadied her with a hand on her elbow. The tech left them standing there, uncertainty hanging heavy in the air. Slowly, Lillian reached out, finding Jake's hand. He threaded his fingers through hers, squeezing tight. They stood like that, drawing strength from each other, neither willing to let go. The minutes crawled by. Each tick of the clock felt like a small eternity. Then, finally, the surgery light above the double doors blinked off. They held their breath as Dr. Roberts pushed through the doors, his expression carefully neutral. "We did everything we could." The recovery room was dim and quiet, except for the steady beep of monitors. Max lay on a padded table, his golden fur dulled under the fluorescent lights, tubes and wires connected to his still form. Dr. Roberts stood by the door, his voice gentle but firm. "The procedure went well, but he's weak. The next 24 hours are critical." Lillian moved to Max's side, her fingers trembling as she stroked his fur. Jake remained by the door, his broad shoulders tense, eyes fixed on Max's chest, rising and falling with shallow breaths. The clock on the wall ticked away minutes that felt like hours. Lillian's mind drifted to Noah's words from the night before, his voice full of desperate certainty. "He came back to us once. He'll do it again." She held on to that hope like a lifeline. Dr. Roberts came in periodically, checking vitals and adjusting medications. Each time his face remained neutral, giving away nothing. The sunset painted the room in orange, then faded to darkness. Still, they waited. Jake hadn't moved from his spot, but his voice broke through the silence. "He's a fighter." Lillian looked up at him, seeing the worry etched in his features. "Like you," she said softly. The clock struck midnight. Max hadn't stirred. Lillian's phone buzzed, a text from Noah. "Is he okay?" Her fingers felt heavy as she typed, "Still waiting." The room fell silent again, save for the rhythmic beeping. Jake had finally moved closer, standing behind Lillian's chair, his hand resting on her shoulder, Then, something changed. A small movement caught their eye. Max's tail twitched just slightly against the padding. Lillian gasped, gripping Jake's hand. "Did you see that?" They both leaned forward, hardly daring to breathe. Max's eyes fluttered, opening for just a moment before closing again. But it was enough. That tiny glimpse of brown eyes sparked something in both of them. Hope. Morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of the recovery room, casting warm stripes across the floor. Lillian had fallen asleep in her chair, her head resting on the edge of Max's bed, one hand still buried in his fur. Jake sat beside her, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but refusing to close. He'd been watching Max's chest rise and fall all night, counting each breath like a prayer. Dr. Roberts entered quietly, clipboard in hand. His face broke into a small smile as he checked Max's vitals. He made it through the night. That's a good sign. Lillian stirred at his voice, blinking away sleep. She met Jake's gaze, and they shared a look of pure relief that made their eyes shine with tears. A soft thump drew their attention. Max's tail was moving weakly against the table, his eyes open but tired. Before anyone could speak, the door burst open. Noah rushed in, his backpack still on, Gina following behind with Oliver. The older boy's eyes were already wet as he approached the table. "Max?" he whispered. Oliver moved more carefully, wrapping his arms gently around Max's neck. "We missed you, boy." Dr. Roberts brought a water bowl, and they all watched with bated breath as Max lifted his head slightly, lapping at the water. It was such a simple thing, but it made Lillian's heart soar. "I think he's going to pull through," Dr. Roberts said, smiling at the family gathered around his patient. "He's showing all the right signs." The tension that had gripped them for days finally broke. Noah laughed through his tears, Oliver bounced on his toes, and Gina wiped her eyes discreetly in the corner. Lillian turned to Jake, her hand finding his. "Thank you," she said softly, "for fighting for him." Jake squeezed her hand, his voice rough with emotion. "We fought for him, together." They watched as Max's eyes drifted closed again, but this time his sleep was peaceful. His tail still thumped occasionally, as if reassuring them he was okay. For the first time in days, they all took a deep, relieving breath. The autumn sun painted the yard in warm golden hues as Max lounged on the grass, his tail sweeping lazily across the ground. Though still moving carefully, his eyes sparkled with contentment as Noah and Oliver fussed over him. "Easy with those treats, boys," Lillian called from the porch, but she couldn't hide her smile. Oliver was giving Max yet another belly rub while Noah scratched behind his ears, Max's favorite spot. "He's earned it, Mom," Noah protested, pulling another dog biscuit from his pocket. Jake chuckled beside her on the porch swing, their shoulders touching. The wooden swing creaked gently as they rocked, watching the scene before them. The evening air was crisp but not cold, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and approaching winter. "We've been through a lot," Jake said quietly, his voice thoughtful. His eyes stayed fixed on Max and the boys, but his hand found Lillian's on the swing between them. Lillian nodded, feeling the weight of his words. "More than I ever imagined." She turned to look at him, studying his profile. "So what now?" Jake met her gaze, his expression serious but soft. "I don't know about fate, but I know I don't want to walk away from this." His thumb traced circles on her palm, sending tingles up her arm. Lillian squeezed his hand, her heart beating faster. "Neither do I." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Then Noah's voice broke through. "Hey, Mom, can Jake stay for dinner?" "Please?" Jake smiled. "Actually, I was thinking maybe I could stay for more than just dinner." He looked at the boys. "If that's okay with everyone?" Oliver's face lit up. "You mean like Forever? Yeah, Jake said softly. Like forever. Noah stood up, his hand still resting on Mac's head. Really? Lillian nodded, tears pricking at her eyes. Really? Max wagged his tail harder, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. He barked once, happy and clear, making everyone laugh. Jake pulled Lillian closer, kissing her softly. The kiss lingered, sweet and full of promise. Lillian pulled back, smiling. Guess he approves. Jake's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled back. Good, because I'm never leaving. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows, casting warm patches on the tile floor, where Max dozed contentedly. Lillian poured orange juice for the boys while they munched on their cereal, the quiet morning routine feeling comfortable and familiar. A knock at the door made Mac's ears perk up. His tail started wagging before Lillian even reached for the handle. When she opened it, Jake stood there, a well-worn duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His expression was a mix of nervousness and hope. Hi, he said simply, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. Lillian felt her heart skip. They'd talked about this, planned it carefully, but seeing him actually standing there made it real. She stepped aside, gesturing him in. Come in. Jake moved past her, his familiar scent of coffee and aftershave filling her senses. Max jumped up immediately, circling him with excited barks, his tail wagging furiously. Oliver's eyes widened at the sight of the duffel bag. Does this mean you're moving in? He asked around a mouthful of cereal. Noah set down his spoon, his expression more serious as he studied his mother's face. Are you happy, Mom? Lillian felt warmth spread through her chest as she looked at Jake, who was already kneeling to scratch Max behind the ears. Yeah, she said softly, meaning it more than she had expected to. I am. Jake straightened up and set his duffel bag down by the stairs. The simple action felt momentous, like the period at the end of a long sentence. Max immediately flopped down at his feet as if he'd always belonged there. The boys returned to their breakfast, already accepting this new normal with the easy adaptability of children. Jake took a seat at the table, and Lillian reached for the coffee pot to fill his mug. Their hands brushed as she passed it to him, and this time, neither pulled away. Max's tail thumped against the floor, a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the contentment in the room. Through the window, morning light painted everything in soft gold, making this ordinary moment feel somehow magical. The evening sun painted the sky in soft oranges and pinks as Lillian and Jake sat on the porch swing, their shoulders touching. The gentle creaking of the swing mixed with the sound of laughter from the yard, where Noah and Oliver were throwing a tennis ball for Max. The old golden retriever's energy had returned fully after his surgery, and he bounded after the ball with the enthusiasm of a much younger dog. Jake watched them, his heart full. A year ago, his apartment had been empty except for Max and his own demons. Now, looking at the boys playing in the yard that had become home, he could hardly believe how much had changed. Penny for your thoughts? Lillian asked softly, nudging his shoulder. Before Jake could answer, Noah walked up the porch steps, hands stuffed deep in his pockets. His expression was serious, almost nervous. He stopped in front of Jake, shifting from foot to foot. Hey. Noah started, then paused, taking a deep breath. Is it okay if I call you Dad? Jake felt the air leave his lungs. His heart seemed to stop for a moment. Beside him, he heard Lillian's sharp intake of breath. Oliver, who had followed his brother, piped up from the bottom of the steps. Yeah, 'cause you kinda are now. Jake swallowed hard against the lump in his throat. Everything he'd lost, everything he'd been afraid of. It all led to this moment. He stood up and knelt in front of the boys, his voice rough with emotion. "I'd be honored," he managed to say. Noah's face broke into a wide smile, and suddenly Jake found himself wrapped in a tight hug. Oliver launched himself forward, joining the embrace. Max, sensing the emotional moment, trotted up the steps and pressed himself against them, his tail wagging furiously. Lillian watched from the swing, wiping away tears as her family, their family, came together. The setting sun cast a golden glow over them all, making the moment feel almost magical. As darkness began to settle over the yard, Jake looked at Lillian, his eyes shining. "This is home," he whispered. She smiled, her heart full. "Yeah, it is." The familiar scent of the animal shelter brought back a flood of memories as Lillian knelt beside a small kennel. Inside, a golden retriever mixed puppy wagged its tail hopefully, pressing its wet nose against her fingers through the cage. The puppy's fur was a lighter shade than Max's, almost champagne-colored, with white patches on its chest and paws. Mrs. Callahan, still working at the shelter after all these years, smiled warmly at the family. Max sat obediently beside Jake, watching the scene with interest. "Can we really get another dog?" Oliver bounced on his toes, eyes wide with excitement. Lillian nodded, her heart full, as she watched the puppy roll onto its back, begging for belly rubs. "Max needs a friend, and it feels right." Mrs. Callahan knelt beside Lillian, unlocking the kennel. "You're giving him a second chance, just like Max got." Her eyes twinkled knowingly. She'd been there that day, years ago, when Lillian had to leave Max behind. Now here they were, complete in a way none of them could have imagined back then. Jake watched Lillian interact with the puppy, marveling at how far she'd come from the broken woman he'd first met. The pain in her eyes had been replaced with joy, her hesitation with confidence. The puppy bounded out of the kennel, immediately rolling around at their feet. Noah laughed as it tried to chase its own tail. "We should call him Lucky," Oliver declared, picking up the squirming puppy. "Because he's lucky to have us, just like we're lucky to have each other." Max stepped forward cautiously, sniffing the new addition to their family. After a moment of consideration, his tail began to wag, and he gave the puppy a gentle lick. Noah grinned. "I think he approves." Jake squeezed Lillian's hand as they watched their boys fawn over the puppy. Mrs. Callahan grabbed her camera, the same one she'd used to photograph countless adoption moments. "Let's get a picture of the whole family," she suggested. They gathered together, Jake with his arm around Lillian, the boys kneeling in front with Lucky wiggling in Oliver's arms, and Max sitting proudly beside them. The camera clicked, capturing the moment forever. As they drove home, Lucky curled up contentedly in Oliver's lap. Lillian glanced around at her family. Jake focused on driving, the boys in the back seat cooing over their new puppy, Max watching it all from his spot in the trunk area. This was everything she never knew she needed. Golden morning sunlight spilled across the backyard as Noah tossed a tennis ball, sending both Max and Lucky racing after it. The grass was still damp with dew, and the dog's paws left wet prints on the concrete patio. Oliver cheered as Lucky managed to grab the ball first, though Max didn't seem to mind, content to chase his younger companion around the yard. "Lucky, come here! I'm going to teach you to roll over," Oliver called out. Noah crossed his arms. "No way! I'm teaching him tricks. You already taught Max to shake hands." "Did not? Dad taught him that." On the porch, Lillian smiled into her coffee mug, breathing in the warm aroma. Jake sat beside her in the wooden rocking chair, their shoulders touching. The morning was peaceful. No emergencies, no hospital shifts, just the sound of children's laughter and playful barking. Jake cleared his throat softly. "I was thinking, we should make this official." Lillian's heart skipped a beat. "Official?" A knowing smirk played across Jake's face. "Yeah, marriage, Lillian." She nearly choked on her coffee, coughing slightly. "You don't waste time, do you?" Jake's laugh was warm and deep. "Not when I know what I want." Lillian leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his shoulder. Her voice was soft but sure. "Ask me again in a few months." Jake pressed a gentle kiss to the top of her head. "Deal." In the yard, Lucky darted between the boys' legs, tail wagging wildly as they continued their friendly argument. "Mom," Oliver called out, "tell Noah I get to train Lucky." "No way," Noah protested. "I'm older." Before either parent could respond, both dogs suddenly took off after a squirrel that had ventured too close to their territory. The boys' disagreement was instantly forgotten as they watched Max and Lucky chase the bushy-tailed intruder up a tree. Lillian snuggled closer to Jake, their coffee growing cold, but neither minding. The morning stretched out before them, full of possibility. She looked at their blended family, the boys, the dogs, this man who had somehow become everything to her. "We've come a long way," she whispered. Jake squeezed her hand gently. "And we've got forever to go." The backyard was transformed with twinkling lights and white flowers. Chairs lined a makeshift aisle, and a simple arch draped with roses stood at the end. Max and Lucky sat perfectly still, their black bow ties a stark contrast against their golden fur. Noah and Oliver, dressed in matching suits, stood on either side of Lillian. Her white dress was simple but elegant, and her eyes sparkled with happy tears. "Ready, Mom?" Noah asked, offering his arm. Oliver grabbed her other hand. "We practiced this, remember?" The music started, and they began walking. Jake stood at the arch, his breath catching at the sight of them, his family, his future. During the vows, Jake's voice trembled slightly. "I never thought I'd find this kind of love again. You and the boys, you saved me as much as Max did." Lillian wiped away tears. "You showed me it was okay to open my heart again. You helped me believe in second chances." When they kissed, the boys erupted in cheers. Max let out a joyful bark, as if he understood the significance of the moment. Lucky, still a puppy at heart, started running in excited circles around them, making everyone laugh. Their first dance was to a slow song, swaying under the string lights. Jake held Lillian close, whispering, "I love you," against her hair.
At the cake cutting, Lucky tried to sneak a taste, making Oliver giggle and Noah roll his eyes affectionately.
On a small table near the guest book sat a framed photo of Daniel, Lillian's late husband, smiling in his firefighter uniform. It wasn't about holding on to the past, but acknowledging how far they'd all come. Noah nudged Oliver. "Told you this was going to happen." As the sun began to set, casting everything in a golden glow, the family took a walk around the yard. Max and Lucky trotted ahead, their bow ties slightly crooked from all the excitement. Lillian turned to Jake, her new ring catching the light. "You still think you don't believe in fate?" Jake grinned, pulling her close. "I believe in us." Their kiss was sweet and tender as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, a perfect ending to a perfect day, and the beginning of their new chapter together. If you enjoyed the story of Lillian, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it,